The Battle of the Kuban, one of the main air battles of the Second World War. In the spring and summer of 1943, thousands of German and Soviet airplanes clashed above a small peninsula, where bitter trench fighting raged. Welcome to the new series where the Battle of the Kuban will be covered in detail. November 1942. The German 6th Army had almost completely seized Stalingrad. At the same time, to the south, the oil-rich Caucasus was partially occupied by the 17th Army and the 1st Panzer Army. These were the two main objectives of Germany's summer offensive, and victory was close. The situation seemed dire for the Soviets, but a counterattack on November 19 quickly reversed the situation. And soon the Germans found themselves surrounded in Stalingrad. The subsequent disaster is very well known. But more relevant to our story is what happened in the Caucasus. There, Germany was weary of abandoning the gains made in the previous months, especially because the German industry desperately needed oil. As the situation to the north worsened, a scenario arose in which German forces could be cut off in the Caucasus. Nonetheless, this front line remained inactive for more than a month after the Soviet counterattack at Stalingrad. Only on December 29 was a limited retreat finally authorized. Naturally, the Soviet armies pursued, and, as the situation became dire, the controlled retreat turned into a dash for safety. Most motorized, mechanized and armored units were able to evacuate through Rostov. The rest went mostly into the Kuban Delta region. This region was being fortified since January 4, 1943, with a series of defensive lines called Gottenkopfstellung, German for God's Head Position. This defensive line also became known as the Blue Line, a name that apparently came into being when Hitler used a blue pencil to draw it on a map. By February 1943, the German 17th Army and a small part of the 1st Panzer Army had successfully retreated into that area. Considering the complicated situation, it was a successful result, but one that ended with a large number of vehicles, guns and supplies left behind. The 17th Army was able to stabilize the front line. Still, the Soviet momentum was high, and the Germans kept being pushed back, leading to the liberation of Krasnodar, the largest city in the region. In the meantime, as the front line got narrower, it became harder for the Soviets to make use of their greater numbers. With the intent of bypassing the German defenses, the Soviets conducted an amphibious landing to the south of Novorossiysk. On February 4, Soviet troops landed at Stanichka as a diversion for a major landing assault at Ozereka Bay. The main landing was a fiasco, but the diversionary one was able to hold and expand, encompassing the Mizhako Mount. This became known as the Mizhako Bridgehead, or as the Malaya Zemlya, meaning little land in Russian. This small piece of land would become of major importance. The Soviets advanced very little during March, and we start our series on April 4 with the first Battle of Krimskaya. But before we see how this small corner of the world became the stage of one of the biggest air battles in history, let's take a look at how things stood at this point. The battle owes its name to the Kuban River. Originating on the slopes of Mount Elbrus, Europe's highest peak, the Kuban flows west until reaching the Sea of Azov in the Temryuk Bay. The Kuban Delta is situated on the Taman Peninsula, which is separated from Crimea by the Kerch Strait. This strait is 3 to 15 kilometers wide. Although a massive bridge now connects the two land masses, there was none in 1943. Hitler ordered a 6-kilometer bridge to be built over the Kerch Strait on March 7, but it was never completed. At this point, the Germans held a small area of less than 80 per 70 kilometers. To the north, the Kuban River Delta made for a very poor battlefield. Several lagoons and impassable quagmires covered this region. The Germans nicknamed this area the Lagoon. Immediately to its south, the riverlands consisted of mostly marshland. Although these bogs can't be seen today through satellite pictures, they used to extend well south of the Kuban River. The Soviet pilot Alexander Pokryshkin described them this way. Gradually, the mountains became lower and lower, and soon they were replaced by hills. Behind them were the huge floodplains of the Kuban. I have seen the Kuban flood more than once from the air, but I don't remember anything like it now. The river filled all the floodplains and merged with estuaries and rivulets. It looked as if the Sea of Azov was approaching Krasnodar. In the far south, the important city of Novorossiysk was almost entirely under German control. It was surrounded by mountains and situated along the shore of the beautiful Tsemes Bay. The Soviets controlled the small Mizhako bridgehead, immediately south, and were supported by their artillery from the main front line, which had range to fire over the city and bay. Thanks to the forested mountains, the south wasn't ideal for large-scale attacks either. This left a narrow 12-kilometer corridor of ideal terrain near the town of Krimskaya. Naturally, the Germans deeply reinforced this position. There were 5 defensive lines with up to 60 kilometers in depth. These lines were not what you would expect by the name, being mostly trenches, minefields and several wooden bunkers. Still, the German 17th Army was aptly entrenched and in a good defensive position. The Kuban area was a logistical nightmare for the Germans, since supplies had to be brought by sea and air. During the winter months, Kerch Harbor had frozen, meaning that for a while all the supplies were brought by aircraft. The German air transport fleet had been decimated during the Stalingrad campaign, and FW-200s and DO-24s were pressed into service to fly in supplies. The situation got better from March on, when the German Navy was once again able to assist, and Ju-52 transports were introduced. Still, the number of supplies being brought into the Kuban area was never more than the minimum necessary. Even though there were a lot of important differences, the situation had some similarities to that of the 6th Army trapped in Stalingrad. It could easily turn into a disaster. At this point, Germany had more than 200,000 men in the Taman Peninsula, reinforced by roughly 60,000 Romanians. They were divided into 11 German divisions and 5 Romanian ones. These were split into 3 corps. To the north, the 49th Mountain Corps. In the center, the 44th Army Corps. And, to the south, the 5th Army Corps. Army Group A had only the 17th Army and was commanded by Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist. The Soviet Union had about 400,000 troops on the Kuban front, divided among 5 armies. In the north, the Soviets had the 58th, the 9th and the 37th armies. Facing the main action near Krimskaya was the 56th Army. Finally, occupying the extreme south and the Mishako bridgehead was the 18th Army. On the bridgehead itself, in a very small strip of land, the Soviet Union had about 15,000 troops at this point. These armies all belonged to the North Caucasus Front Army Group, and were under the command of General Polkovnik Ivan Maslenikov. When it came to armored vehicles, the Kuban front line had a low priority, and the Germans had only about 20 main battle tanks, 30 assault guns, and 2 companies of tank destroyers. Luckily for the Germans, the Soviets also placed low importance on this front. At this point, there were close to 200 tanks available, with the majority being outdated Lend-Lease types and light Soviet tanks. There were only a handful of modern armored vehicles present. At first, Germany had a limited number of aircraft in the region, although that would change quickly. There was a total of about 330 aircraft, of which 70 were fighters, 50 dive bombers, 70 level bombers, 40 recon, and 100 transports. Most fighter units were at Anapa airfield, and a few others at Taman. Dive bomber units were mostly at Kerch, and the level bombers and transports were at Bagarova and Zamorsk in Crimea. The Soviet Union had in excess of 550 aircraft. Of those, about 220 were fighters, 270 were bombers of all types, and the remaining were recon and transport planes. Initially, most aircraft used by the Soviet Union on this front line were outdated. Gelendzhik housed the majority of Soviet naval air units, as well as some VVS fighter units. The remaining units were spread across several airfields like Abinskaya, Timashevskaya, Popovisheskaya and Krasnodar. The Germans had relatively few naval assets in the region. 2 fleets of landing craft, 1 fleet of minesweepers, and a fleet of fast attack craft. The Soviets had some large surface vessels in the Black Sea, but they were reluctant to employ them due to German air power. For a long period after the landings at Mishako, the Black Sea fleet saw little action. The heavy cruiser Voroshilov, the light cruisers Krasny Krim and Krasny Kavkaz, 6 destroyers and several minesweepers and gunboats were present in the area. In this series, we will look at some of these units, commanders and vehicles as they become relevant. In the second episode, which will come out in a few days, we'll continue our story and dive right into the action with the first battle of Krimskaya. Thank you very much for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content.